Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently had the pleasure of talking with Professor Rachel Fulton Brown on the subject of historical fiction, though as you might imagine, the conversation did, range over a variety of subjects. If you don't know who she is, I'm going to read a short biography of her. Rachel Fulton Brown is Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Her field specialties are the history of Christianity, medieval European intellectual, cultural, and religious history, medieval liturgy, the cult of the Virgin Mary, scriptural exegesis and hermeneutics, and subcreation, and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. She is the author of Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought, From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, and co-editor of History in the Comic Mode, Medieval Communities and the Matter of Person, all from Columbia University Press. She has been a fencer for many years, holding the USFA rating of B18 foil, and is currently a member of the Fencing Center of Chicago. Her thoughts on a variety of topics can be found on her blog, Fencing Bear at Prayer. She has also been a guest on a variety of YouTube shows, which are collected on her blog page, Bear on Air. She lives in Chicago and has a dog named Joy, which can occasionally be heard in the background as she discusses medieval history on YouTube. So, it's a very interesting conversation, and I hope you find it as interesting as I did. Professor, I'm very intrigued by something you had mentioned when it comes to historical fiction, and I'm thinking here of fiction that is written in the modern time but set historically, because there's another very interesting related subject. And you had said that it suffers from the same problem that all historical forgeries do, which is that in time they become... I forget exactly what the word used, but in time they tend to stand out. And so I'm very curious if you could start on that subject of the nature of historical forgery, since historical fiction of the sort, writing in the present period and setting it a few hundred years ago, is an honest forgery, but a forgery of a kind. And so I'm curious if you could start us on that subject of historical forgeries and how it is that they stand out.
Certainly. And thank you for having me. This is going to be a fun conversation, I hope. So I think what I said when we were talking is that the forgery reveals itself after a time. And the best way to think about this is if you see movies that are set in historical periods, watch their hairstyles. Any movie, I mean, and you can tell it from other things too. It's like the style of dress, the style of setting. It's not just whether or not the set is able to be made to look realistic. There's all sorts of tells that they felt realistic at the time that the movie was made, right? So there's been a little conversation on social media recently about whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie. You can you can date that movie definitely with Holly's hairstyle, right? One of my students sent me a little meme about Lion in Winter, saying, all these ones that think Die Hard is an edgy Christmas movie. Well, there's Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole as Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. And their comments throughout that movie about sort of being modern in 1183 and such. The tells are going to be in all sorts of things that you see that at the time the movie was made, the set dressers, the costumers, the hairstylists and stuff thought looked realistic. They won't. And it doesn't take very long. It takes maybe a decade for suddenly all of those anachronisms just to be screaming at you. If you're a student of history and you've studied it a lot, they affect you quicker, right? Because you're able to see it as of our moment when the movie is made. Sometimes though, things like one of my very favorite medieval, historical fiction movie set in medieval times is A Knight's Tale, the one about Heath Ledger as the jouster. And what was magnificent about that movie is I forgot what the writer's and director's name was, that he made some very conscious decisions to play with that problem of anachronism. So to show that, after the tournament, the kids want to have a dance because in fact, it's, younger people who are the younger women who are watching the men joust, the younger men who are wanting to show off in front of the women, and they have a dance afterwards. It segues into a contemporary song for us. And the actors start dancing in a more modern style and such. And it's like saying, how do you show that at the time was, sort of what the kids were doing? Well, you show it as them being kids now, and then go back to pretending that you're in the Middle Ages. But there are other ways in which the movie, just will never survive eventually as something that's not of around the year 2000. and it's basically the hairstyles. I mean, when the Heath Ledger character starts off and he's the sort of squiring the knight, and he's got dreadlocks, right? It's it's just screaming what was hip in the period in which it was made. So that's my first sort of example. I can certainly go on and explain how I think this works if you'd like me to go further.
In a moment, to ask it as a sort of general question, then, would you say that a big part of it is that whenever you're fabricating something in history, you have to fabricate a large number of details, and anywhere where you yourself, where the one doing the fabrication is not completely conversant with the time period, which is going to be a fair amount if you didn't actually live there, that they will inevitably fabricate it from their imagination in the present. But once time passes, the details that are embedded in the present become themselves dated and thus stand out in the same way that there's a fascinating movie I saw. It was, the first 80s movie, I think, that was ever made. It was made in 1979. And it was entirely an 80s movie in that, you know, the kids had to save the it wasn't a discotheque, it was a roller rink, and you know, from the evil people.
Of course, yes, I was going to the roller rinks in 78 maybe.
Yeah, well, and there was
that dates it as a 70s movie that you cared about the roller rinks.
Yes, and they had the giant collars, but it was the group of plucky young kids who had to save the failing business from the evil people who were going to foreclose on it because of its mortgage, which was very, very pronouncedly an 80s movie plot. Very recognizable. You know, so many movies like Goonies and things of sort of that nature. And so I'm speaking.
I don't know. I think I know you're a fan of Scooby-Doo. I think it's mainly real action Scooby-Doo, but
I never watched
which was 70s too, right? Those cartoons were 70s.
Well, the Scooby-Doo Where Are You was actually late 60s.
Well, there you go. So I think, I mean, even what we're talking about now is even our sense of what fits a particular time period. I mean, you're saying the 79 movie is an 80s movie, that sort of thing will trip you up as well. What, you know, sort of the art historical propensity to figure out what belongs to which, you know, artistic moment. And the Renaissance, the flexibility of the Renaissance is magnificent in those terms. It's like, is Giotto medieval or Renaissance? Well, if you're thinking of him as, you know, in terms of painters, you know, creating realistic body shapes and, you know, perspective and things like that, oh, he definitely belongs in the Renaissance. But if you realize that, of course, he's contemporary with Dante, you say, well, no, actually, he's maybe medieval. Oh, what does that mean? And it's the, you know, this problem of stylistic coherence is another of the features of, I think, what you're trying to touch on there. But there's something else that's going on, and I would like to sort of narrate that for you if I could.
Oh, please.
Okay, so the best book, if you're interested in this problem of realism, is Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in either the Western tradition or Western literature. I can't remember. And he starts with a comparison between Homer's Odyssey and the story in Genesis where Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac. And his premise is both of those, you know, represent reality in some terms, and they're about contemporary as literary creations, but they're doing it in a completely different mode, right? That there's a kind of all present, you know, constantly on stage realism in it's the Odysseus's scar chapter where he starts there and he's describing Odysseus's being recognized by his scar when his old nursemaid is washing his feet. And there's this sense of it's all real, but all sort of plain on the surface, right? We're going to describe the gods acting and it's all sort of brightly lit in this kind of flatness. Whereas the Genesis story is interesting because it's equally real if you're wanting to say there's a reality being represented, but there's a depth to it that is completely lacking in the Homeric version, that there's sort of mysteriousness in the way in which even the details are given. In which you are constantly being gesturing towards this transcendent that just isn't present in the Homeric story. Start there, and you don't even fast forward. It's a very slow read of a book. He goes through ancient representations of scenes. He goes through early medieval representations of scenes. He goes talks about, and this I'll say a bit more about this, medieval mystery plays and the representation of, say, the conversation between Adam and Eve through things like now I can't remember what his chapter on Dante does. He has a good chapter on Don Quixote, for example, patiently getting you up to the 19th century and its modes of social realism. And when I teach this problem of writing historical fiction to my undergraduates, I have a course which you can also see the syllabus for on writing historical fiction, and I have them read these 3 episodes, right? The Homeric comparison with Genesis, the mystery play, the Adam and Eve mystery play, and then the chapters on these 19th century novelists, and showing them that in fact each of those has a moment of representing something real, but it's only when you get to the 19th century novelists with their expectations of things like describing in detail a particular room so as to portray the character of the person who inhabits it. That's what we mean by realism typically. And that's why what I'm trying to get the students to recognize is if they want to write historical fiction, they're most likely writing in a 19th century social realist mode. They're writing in a mode that, say, Victor Hugo invented. They're writing in a mode in which, of course, you want to describe the setting in a particular with particular richness, and the hairstyles and the costumes and the room furnishings and all of that, because you are embedded in a particular expectation of what is real. Now, that's different, for example, from the medieval understanding of what realism means, because in their terms, for example, in this scene between Adam and Eve are described in the moment in the garden, right? And they're having this conversation, but the characters, one way you could read them is Eve is they're a sort of 12th century bourgeois townsman and his wife arguing over something ordinary, right? But in the mode in which the Christians are writing in that period, that's not sufficient, right? You have to understand everything that happens historically to always be having this reference to sacred history, right? And Auerbach is very, very good at describing the way in which he understands this as a figural, and we can go into all of this, right? There's this figural understanding that things in time point to the sort of transcendent reality that they're also participating in. The 19th century has none of that, right? There's nothing transcendent in the way in which, well, it's hard with Hugo sometimes, but there's nothing transcendent in the way in which Hugo is describing in Les Miserables, the speeches that the men give on the barricades about revolution, right? They're gesturing in a historical moment, but they're not meant necessarily to have the same kind of transcendent referent that, say, this Adam and Eve play is. So when I say historical fiction will always have a tell, almost all historical fiction, there are very few examples, it's almost impossible to find any that don't do this, point to trying to write in the mode of novel that was created in the 19th century and which persists to this day as the genre of historical fiction. And so basically I barely read any historical fiction now because it all just screams 19th century at me. There's nothing that can step outside of a mode of secular humanist social realism in most historical fiction, as far as I'm concerned.
Now, there's an interesting distinction which occurs to me as from what you're saying. I mean, there's plenty that occurred, but the thing at the forefront in my mind at the moment is that I think one can usefully distinguish between the style of writing, because say a popular book like of historical fiction, where sort of our conversation began before this one, in the Cadfile by Alice Peters.
Mm-hmm.
That Cadfile is very explicitly meant to be told in the manner of a story told today, but its contents are set in the historical period. So it's not at all purporting at any level to have a historical way of telling a story. But
no, her genre, and the thing is, that's why Auerbach is good. He's talking you through style, essentially, right? That there's a storytelling style that you need to be aware of, and how it makes different demands on your understanding of what's real.
Interesting. So, to some degree, I mean, would you say then that the style of the storytelling to at least some measure would have to fit the actual period in which the story is being told in order to really be true to the period?
Well, that's the challenge that I set my students in this writing historical fiction class, because I have them do various exercises, one of which is take one of their primary sources, so something written at the time that they're actually trying to imagine themselves into, and mimic its style, right? And it's a kind of exercise that I also take from my Tolkien course, the course that I teach on J.R. Tolkien's method of writing fiction, right? But he's also very sensitive to the way in which he's creating a historical moment through his telling, and that style, the style of the telling is everything. There's a magnificent essay by Ursula Le Guin on this problem of writing fantasy. She calls From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, and saying she does this sort of trick with a fantasy novel where she changes nothing but the place names and the character names. And in the fantasy novel, it's, you know, high elf lords having some conversation about great matters of, you know, alliance and stuff like that. But if you change the name so it's basically set in Washington D.C., you realize all that the author has done is take a completely modern political mode of conversation, dress it up in costume with these place names and character names, and dumped it right back in the story. And for the most part, that's the problem with historical fiction as well, that you're imagining yourself into this mode, but you're not changing anything about your style of storytelling. And so basically, if you can do that trick on your own work, if you can just change your cleverly crafted names, and it drops back into the present like that, you have not sufficiently immersed yourself in a different style to create a different world. And that for Le Guin is the great test of fantasy. If you can actually transform your own storytelling style sufficiently to create this new world, you've succeeded in a way that most authors find it very difficult to do. I get it, right? It's incredibly difficult to write yourself into a different mode of speaking.
It is. It's even more difficult, I think, is writing yourself into a different mode of thinking.
Yes.
Because it actually brings up a very there's a very interesting point about, you know, the nature of history, that at different times people had different concerns. You alluded to this, and part of it too is when you alluded to the secular humanist mode of expression. There's an interesting theory I've heard, by the way, that the modern novel is in many ways a fundamentally Protestant idea, whereas the epic is a fundamentally Catholic one. That the novel is about one person, and and as such tends toward that sort of very Protestant atomizing effect. You can see it most clearly in that meme Jesus idea, but even more broadly, I mean, you can see from the beginnings of Luther, the idea that religion became something very personal, very individual. There's very much sort of a breakdown of community very early on within Protestantism, and I mean, I'm slightly overstating it, but
well, the best novel to prove your point is Robinson Crusoe, which I use in my Eurociv class, and I use it at the end of our discussion of the Middle Ages. And one of the things that I'm trying to get them to see is what layers of symbolism Defoe is actually using. It's very interesting. If you think of Robinson Crusoe, he's the prototypical lone adventurer, right? He's stranded on an island. What's interesting about it, though, is what saves him. And, you know, you think of it saving him because he's able to rebuild civilization because of the things that he took off his ship when he's shipwrecked. But in fact, if you notice what happens in the diary that he keeps, he learns to pray, right? But and what's curious about it, Defoe is doing some really curious and interesting things there. He learns to pray partly because he gets some popish prayer books off this ship when he's shipwrecked. So he's English, but he's with now I can't remember what the captain is, whether he's Spanish or Portuguese. He's been in Brazil, so it's Portuguese. So he has some of the older tradition. He has some of the church. He makes a raft out of a cross plank, right? So when he gets off the ship, he saves himself with the cross, and he learns to pray because he's confessed himself ungrateful and so forth. But he's able, once he's started his sort of prayer practice and thankfulness, to live for a very long time all by himself, right? So and it's a Protestant problem because he's trying to run away from his father sort of setting him up in business, right? He wants to go have adventures instead of following the middle way and becoming a proper bourgeois merchant. So yes, I think, and you could say that Robinson Crusoe is often said to be the earliest novel. If indeed it's the earliest novel, then it fits your premise there that there's a Protestant spirituality behind that, the individual soul discovering itself, but for Crusoe through prayer, right? So it's still very Christian story.
Yeah, I forget who passed that on to me. It was an interesting idea when it was mentioned to me. Whereas the Catholic has fundamentally, you can see this even in J.R.R. Tolkien, that what does he write? He writes an epic. That there's a community, that human beings exist in community, and that human beings exist in community in a primary sort of sense, not an accidental sense. That which you can see, even in the Catholic practice, that in Catholic, especially in the little c sense of the word, including like our Eastern Orthodox brethren, that you have the priest who unites the people, and so there's a community where the believer is not complete in himself, but requires the priest in a practical sort of sense. Whereas Protestant pulls very far away from that in a practical sense. They really, I mean, you can find some high Lutherans and stuff, but as a typical sort of thing, Protestants often dislike priests and sacraments and so on. Their instincts tend very much and constantly re-pull them away whenever they do have something like within the Anglican Church. They have these bouts of pulling away from it. So I don't want to go too far down the theological side, but in terms of the novel and in terms of historical concerns, that the idea of being concerned with the individual as an individual, especially as an atomized individual who happens to find himself amongst others, is something that I can easily see projected onto the past at a time when it seems at least very likely people would not have thought in those terms. When you go back to taking the case of Cadfael, Catholic England in the very early 1100s, right?
Yes, it's during the anarchy, the battles between Stephen and Matilda. Yeah,
which was the early mid 1100s.
I should have all these dates off the top of my head. She starts them in 1138. I'm pretty sure with the. Please look this up and check it. I haven't read Cadfael in many years, and I don't remember exactly when her stories are set, but they're set in Shrewsbury, and they're set around the time that Shrewsbury was involved in that conflict.
Yes. Yeah. So that's less than 100 years after William the Conqueror, right?
Yes.
So it's still, there's still, although she doesn't really get into the Norman Saxon stuff nearly as much as, say, the Errolf and Robin Hood does. But to speak of historical fiction.
And she keeps them, I mean, they're a fairly compressed time period that she's dealing with. And she starts in the middle of the conflict between Stephen and Matilda. And she wrote so many books. She was kind of stuck with the number of murders that Cadfael is having to investigate in a very short amount of time are unusual even for that period of anarchy.
Yeah, that's the there's a in Gaudy Night there's the preface when there's the apology. It's something that's fallen out a little bit, got compressed to the very short. This is a work of fiction. Any similarity to persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Older novel traditions tended to have an actual apology to. And especially Gaudy Night did, where she said it'd be idle to say that Oxford doesn't actually exist, so it's all the more important to apologize for saddling them with all the stuff that she did.
Yes, with this fictional college that she gives them.
Yes, and it's fictional wayward students, but there's the part at the very end of her introduction. We said the novelist's only true home is Cloud Cuckoo Land, and especially the mystery novelists, and there's a great truth to that. The consulting detective in any form is a fundamentally unrealistic character. They don't exist in real life. I mean, not as such. So the moment you have them, there's some definite falsehood to any period in history whatsoever that you simply have to introduce, because people don't generally kill each other off in interesting ways. When people do kill each other off, it tends to be in very boring ways. And so
yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's ways that make a lot of news, but not intellectually interesting ways. So there's a fundamental falsity that's involved in any detective story, really. Most anyone.
But also think, I mean, the detective story is a 19th century invention. That consulting detective character is again a feature of a particular moment in storytelling, and
a very late 19th century.
And English, right? It's a very English character too. You think it's a very English genre. Obviously, there are stories that are set in other periods and by writers, but it's of a kind of well, so you were also asking me why doesn't Sayers put a Christian character into Lord Peter's stories? And I was saying, well, Lord Peter is. I blog post on that that I know you read too, and you don't agree with me. That one of the things that Sayers says, and we're getting off the problem of the fiction here, but Sayers is obviously great in terms of meditating on her own craft. That the detective novel is a fundamentally moral exercise. I mean, that the consulting detective is acting on the part of justice, right? And one of the reasons I think Lord Peter in her stories is actually fundamentally, I think he's Christ-like in many ways, but she also shows him wrestling with this problem of justice and mercy regularly, right? That at the end of the very first book, that he ends up in sort of what we would now call PTSD from the trenches, affected by this problem of he's found out, he solved the puzzle, which serves justice, but he recognizes that at least in the period she's writing, this person is now going to be hanged, and so he's in effect taken a life by way of his exposing the activities of the sinner, and that's a conundrum. And I think that it's appropriate that Cadfael is a monk, although I appreciate you also have reservations about whether or not he's supposed to be wandering around. He's not. He's supposed to be in his cloister. And the excuse is that Peter's always gives, he's collecting herbs constantly, right? It's like, no, they'd be in his herb garden. He would not be out wandering around looking for them.
Actually, it's very rare that it's much more often the abbot charges him to go do something, or
yes, he gets permission.
The sheriff requests of the abbot to loan him Cadfael.
Yeah,
having friends in high places is very good for a detective.
There are there were problems keeping those Benedictines in their cloisters, and not just because the sheriff was asking for help, but that impulse to seek out truth for the sake of justice is fundamentally theologically Christian, and it makes sense that these characters come out of that tradition, that they are wanting to bring justice for the innocent who've been killed, and obviously, if the murder victim is less innocent, that creates other sort of conundrums for the detective. But that sort of exploration of justice is at the heart of the genre.
Well, there's also the sense of right ordering. This is something
yes.
a friend of mine who's a Franciscan brother had pointed out, this theory that the murders almost always being unrealistic or covered up in unrealistic ways. With a little asterisk, there are people who presumably do get away with murder because they're clever, but they usually just get away with it because they manage to disguise it. But what you have is the destruction of the right ordering of the world through the misuse of reason. And so what you have in the consulting detective is somebody who comes in and through the right use of reason fixes this and reorders the world back to its proper ordering within the hierarchy of being. So there's a very Christian sense there that the detective fits in very well with the Christian culture, in that it is looking at a fallen world and the use of reason that goes and fixes it, in the same way that Christ is described as the second Adam, that you have the first Adam who fell and the second Adam who then fixes things, or Mary again is the second Eve. That in a sense that the fall of Adam and Eve is fixed by a second Adam and a second Eve, so that their Christianity has very much that sense of that the world that has fallen through the misuse of freedom will actually be fixed again through the right uses of these things. So you can see very much an echo there in the consulting detective of the general Christian soteriology.
Yes, and that enables me to bring back the question of the figural, right, that Auerbach points out, and that he's credited with giving this particular description, but it's there always in Christian sort of medieval Christian exegesis of the Bible, that you are reading historical stories, say well, Abraham and Isaac is an obvious example, or stories about David, or I mean, the kind of work that I've worked on, reading things like the Song of Songs as historically a love song written by King Solomon for his bride, right? But then in um, Christian exegesis, particularly pre-modern Christian exegesis, you read figurally to understand what that story points to, also in reality, right? And this is why Tolkien often said he disliked allegory, that he preferred history, true or feigned. As I understand that, that's because he's working primarily in this older understanding of what history does, that it points to realities that are also let's see, they're not just symbols, right? They're actual parallel realities that the one image points to with the other. So you're saying Christ is the new Adam, or Mary is the new Eve. So Adam and Eve are real historical figures, historical in the sense of they fit in the narrative. They have story truth in their own experience. But then that interaction in the garden points to the interaction that Christ and Mary have at the incarnation and at the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so you have to understand both stories and watch the way they map onto each other. That's different from allegory, which is in the way that Tolkien is criticizing it, it's really more of a early modern phenomenon. For example, Pilgrims Progress, which is the other great Protestant novel from it's not novel, right? It's whatever it is, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress from the 17th century, where you have a character called Christian, going through a sort of allegorical landscape, encountering different difficulties like Vanity Fair and the having to swim the river to be baptized and things like that. And they're sort of real but not real in the adventures that he has in them, because they're always overlaid with that sense that this symbolizes this other thing. That kind of allegory is different from the figural reading of stories. So saying Solomon wrote the Song of Songs as a bridal song, and then that Mary and Christ in the medieval reading are historically also in that conversation, that the Song of Songs is a conversation between Mary and Christ. This is a way of thinking that modern people find very, very difficult, right? They want history as one thing, and they want symbolism as this other thing. And saying that as something historically real is also symbolically true of this layered story is very hard for most modern readers to get their heads around.
Yeah, well, again, it fits very easily, I think, in the Christian mind, that the world was spoken into existence.
Mm-hmm.
And Christ is the logos, that the world is fundamentally a story, that a story is the most real thing that exists within the Christian mind. Well, I mean, God's the most real thing that exists, but within creation.
Well, no, that's nominalist. I'm learning this theology to talk about God's existence as a nominalist problem. If you're worrying about God's existing, you're missing the point of his being the creator.
Well, right. I just want to preserve the distinction that God is more real than creation. That's all. But that aside,
it just depends on the meaning of the word "is."
It does. The real thing I'm trying to preserve is that creation is not God. That creation is created and not the creator.
Yes.
That it stands in that relationship. So that's the only thing I was really trying to preserve there. Because it's something always, especially in the modern context, to bear in mind that we're not God. Every time period has its things it loses sight of most, and therefore the things that most.
Well, I think thinking we're not God is the biggest problem human beings tend to thinking we are gods, right? That's the original temptation. You will be like God.
It is. Well, and especially the modern. I mean, since that was the Enlightenment project, was to be God, really. Since we're in the sort of death throes of the Enlightenment, it's something I think that we're not God is something one has to always constantly hammer home, because we live amongst the people who are, we ourselves are most likely to forget this thing. And sort of, which actually brings me back to the idea of every time period has its strengths and its weaknesses. It's something C.S. Lewis mentioned in his advice, that for every book you read published in the last 100 years, you should read an old book as a good way of keeping yourself balanced, because old books will at least have different myopia than you do.
If you do like I do and read enough of the old books, the modern people will think you're crazy. Just telling you.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I didn't name this channel Missing the Mark by accident. But the interesting thing there, though, when it comes to historical fiction, is that it's so very easy, I think, for authors to, with enough research, you can get the dress right. You can get sort of expressions of speech right to at least some degree. I mean, given that they spoke a different language, that if you go
That's
back far enough, they
tricky.
speak a different language, it becomes very tricky to capture.
Le Guin has some, just saying, Christopher, Le Guin has some nice things about that problem too. Speech patterns in her analysis. So yeah.
But you can at the very least capture common phrases. Like there's a wonderful one in Saint Irenaeus against the heresies, which I've against the heresies. I've only read about half of that book so far, but there's this wonderful thing after he went through Gnostic heresy after Gnostic heresy after Gnostic heresy, talking about the different ideas, and this one has this many in the pleroma, and this one has that many in the pleroma, and so on. And he said, well, that suffices. As the saying goes, one does not need to drink the entire sea to know that it is salt. So you can capture things like that. Like you can find out sayings like that and put those, and you do capture something very interesting just by including those sorts of expressions.
Pro tip for students that want to write historical fiction set in the Middle Ages: go to the school textbooks that people read. They all read Aesop's fables, so they all knew those stories. And if you want those sort of proverbial sayings, obviously the Bible, but Cato's distichs are an amazing source of those little phrases. And every schoolboy and every schoolgirl too, because they learn grammar from the same text, would know those sayings. So yeah, go for this. If you go for those sayings, they'd be the kinds of things that people would just have in their repertoire.
So and there's like a great value to that. I mean, there's some interesting, fascinating things when people paint with words, and if a picture's worth 1,000 words, when people paint with words, you can get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of value for word count. But the thing that I think is very hard for a lot of authors to do is to put themselves into the mindset of somebody who had very different concerns. Like modern people being in the death throes of the Enlightenment are very worried about, what is my job? What am I to do? What is the meaning of life? And even from my incredibly amateur sense, somebody in the Middle Ages, a Christian in the Middle Ages, would not be asking what's the meaning of life because he knows.
Right.
I mean, that's straightforward. Everyone around him knows. Everyone knows what the meaning of life is. That's pretty straightforward. And moreover, they had a relatively, I'm not trying to paint the Middle Ages as static, but they had a relatively decent sense of social order, of the social order of the time. Like,
they're having their own problems. We can talk about that, but go on with this thought first.
But just like they didn't, they at least had something of a sense of the social ordering in the having of hierarchies, in common divisions of labor, and
you're romanticizing, I'm afraid. I think I listened to the video that you did on the problem of reading historical fiction seems comforting because we know how things turned out and we don't know what they were worrying about at the time.
Yeah, history is safe because it's over, is what I said.
Right, which I thought was a very good point. And I wrote at length about this problem in my first book, From Judgment to Passion, because I was trying to understand a very significant transformation in the way in the West, medieval Christians imagined themselves in relation to the humanity of Christ. And I appreciate now it's again one of these 19th century carry-ons that in the 19th century, you will not be surprised to hear, there's a great deal of interest in imagining Jesus as a historical figure, right? Social realist Jesus. It's a 19th century concern, right? The search for the historical Jesus. And that fed into the 20th century historiography of the Middle Ages, saying, when did people first start worrying about Christ and his humanity, right? So I come to this in the 1980s as a scholar, 30 years after Richard Southern publishes The Making of the Middle Ages, and he has a significant chapter at the end of that book on, well, the origins of this devotion to the humanity of Christ come in the 11th and 12th century, and it's because of Anselm of Canterbury and St. Francis and the way in which they imagine themselves their personal experience with Christ. Now, you can see there's layers and layers and layers of problems there. One, that you think that they're worrying about the historical Jesus in the way we are. They are not. That they're worrying about experience and the sort of emotional proof of their religiosity in the way the 19th century did. And, you know, that their primary concern is, in fact, Christ and his humanity. Well, so I wrote my first book on this problem. And one of the things I show is some of the way in which they develop all of this imaginative ability to meditate on Christ and Mary's relationship, her sort of wanting to die with him, her compassion for him, the kinds of relationship that they might have had when he's a baby and so forth. They do it through commentaries on the Song of Songs, through meditating on the liturgy. And that shows you where this emphasis on Christ and his humanity comes from. But, okay, so let me unpack these. So there's this problem of imagining ourselves into this historical moment. And the first thing I did was think, okay, I need to find out how they did it. And one of the things that nobody is ever able to explain is why in the 11th and 12th centuries is there this new emphasis apparently on imagining Christ and his humanity. Well, what I suggested, which fit, I think, very well with your concern about what people worry about, was they were actually worried about the second coming, right? In a very specific way around the year 1000, that they're expecting Christ to come. There's pilgrimages that are focused on Jerusalem. When the Caliph al-Hakim destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, there's great expectation that this is the sign that the second coming is going to happen. There's anxiety around 1033, which would be the millennium of the crucifixion in their reckoning. There's efforts to date when the Good Friday falls on the same day as the Annunciation, March 25th. 1065, there's a massive pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It seems that they're more focused on the reality of Christ's suffering and his dying because of that anxiety around the calendar. Well, my colleagues in medieval studies say no, they weren't. Nobody cared. The year 1000 came and went. Nobody noticed. And what was funny is I was writing this book around the year 2000, and everybody was worried about, what was going to happen to the computers in Y2K and stuff like that. The chronological event, which was to a certain extent a massive non-event, and then we had 9/11, 2001, and actually the world did change, but that was an accident of certain other things. What was very, very interesting trying to write that part of my argument in the year 1998, 1999 it was so hard to get my academic colleagues to believe me that anybody would have had those anxieties, right? Because look, nothing happened, right? And so
what about being too modern? Because it's something that really just screamed out at me was because I remember I had a professor who was obsessed with the year 2000 during the year 1999. And he was, oh man, no matter what we were talking about, he's a computer science professor. We're supposed to be talking about algorithms. We hear about the year 2000. We hear about the Y2K problem.
Right.
We're supposed to be talking about, assembly language in a computer. We hear about the year 2000 problem. It drove us mad. And he was more extreme, but I mean, man, there was, there's just so much going on. And I also, one of my degrees is in math. And, I just loathe on a visceral level the idea that there's a deep significance to these arbitrary turning overs of numbers and bases that are just picked to be convenient.
It's not arbitrary. It's counting from the year of our Lord's birth. What are you talking about?
Well, okay, but the thing is, like, if we just
it's even in scripture, for goodness sake.
Yeah, but if our primary thing was every 7th year was something or other, then that you wouldn't have the 1007th year whatever happening at the same time.
Right. And this is a perfect example of the problem that you're worrying about, or you're thinking about. How do you imagine yourself into someone's perception that these sorts of things matter, right? And your professor is an excellent example, right? In retrospect, he looks like a doofus. Nothing happened, right? And that has tended to be apocalyptic predictions come every generation, right? And that was one of the things that was tricky about writing this chapter 2 in my first book. Was I have colleagues who have studied these sort of apocalyptic predictions, over time, and over the centuries, they're regular, right? There it is in 10,000, there it is in 1033, there it is in 1065. It's likely that there were similar concerns in 1095, 1096 when the Crusaders go to Jerusalem. There's mid they happen regularly, but what they don't do is happen that often in one person's lifetime. They happen generationally.
Yeah.
So we're probably going to have we're going to experience another sort of apocalyptic crisis probably within your and my lifetime again, and it will be similar to the one around the year 2000. It will seem fantastic and ridiculous afterwards. But I mean, for example, in your video on people's worrying, you were talking about how people in 1968 in the free love movement were worried about being blown up in a nuclear exchange, and that's gone, and it didn't happen, and so they look silly in retrospect, right? And they grew up and they didn't die in a great nuclear exchange. But at the time, it seems very, very real. And my example with the year 1000, I think, is like yours with 1968. It's very difficult in retrospect to imagine yourself back into that moment, unless you're in a similar moment and you can say, aha, this is how it feels to be in a moment of radical uncertainty about whether there's going to be a tomorrow.
Well, the other thing too, for apocalyptic stuff, I mean, I remember, I since the year 2K stuff is very still kind of fresh in my mind, despite the fact we're now 18 years later, that it's not evenly distributed amongst the population either. And nor does it need to be to have a strong effect.
Right.
If 10% of the people are very concerned about this, and 10%, 30% don't care, and the big chunk in the middle is, kind of, interested but non-committal, you can still get very big social things happening because of that motivated 10%.
Right.
So it's the other thing. You don't need them to be. The year 2000 also illustrates that interesting thing that when you're concerned about things, this would be less with the coming of our Lord, but when you're concerned about things, you take actions to prevent calamities, which can sometimes then result in there not have been something to worry about.
Right.
But only because you actually acted on the thing you were worried about.
Well, and that's with the Y2K, it's like whether or not the computer systems were simply sufficiently well updated that they prevented the problem that the computer scientists were worrying about. So were they right to worry? Who knows? Maybe they fixed it. Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can, this being my field, I can tell you there's a lot of work and a lot of people made a lot of extra money in overtime in the about 6 months leading up to. But everyone was looking through and going through all their code and seeing like, where did we, where could this be mishandled, then rewriting the relevant portions of the programs.
Right. So they took care, potentially they took, so what I argue in my book about the concentration on the crucifixion and Christ and his suffering was that changed the focus of a set of significant people's meditations on the crucifixion, and their works then became the basis for this new emphasis in the later Middle Ages. Peter Damian is a particular character in that, in the Anselm of Canterbury, and then some of my 12th century guys, and they well, like you say, it doesn't take everybody to be concerned about it. It just takes the right people to be concerned about it to create a change in the culture.
Well, what's also interesting, since historical moments change and what people are concerned about change over time too, you can even have things where things that look to us like an accident, you can have something that comes up for whatever reason, but then it happens to shed some particular light on things that people a little bit later are very concerned in, so they keep it going for a different reason than it was even created. So somebody meditated on something for one reason, but then it appealed to somebody else for a very different reason. I mean, you can see that too in Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite authors. He was popular in his day. He was neglected for a while. He's very popular now. We're not wrestling with the dissolution of the English aristocracy, and at the time that Chesterton was writing, they had some very significant problems because almost all of England was owned by a small number of people. Because they had the aristocracy was on its way out.
I think it still is, or a different group of people.
Well, somewhat. I mean, a lot. I mean, yes, in a way.
Yes, they are, and they're not English. I mean, that's a lot of foreign investment is one of the things that Brexit is responding to. They don't own their own country anymore.
Well, yeah, I haven't kept too closely abreast, but one of the social changes that happened, the value of labor went way up relative to to earlier, so people were able to afford much larger rents. People are able to afford much more money for purchase, and the value of land as an agricultural commodity went way down because the mechanization of agriculture. So you had the odd, the sort of odd thing where you had a small landed class who could charge exorbitant rents to people because they happened to be clinging on to the end of a different social organization that had been based in widespread agriculture. And that at least doesn't really exist in the same way, at least. And over here in America, it really doesn't exist. And I'm familiar with the Americans interested in Chesterton.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at Americans, in the 2000s, who are greatly interested in Chesterton's writings and things he's very prophetic about, but many of his concerns are rooted in England in the early 1900s, which eventually a lot of their landed aristocracy sold the land off to other people, and it was subdivided and so on, because it's just, you could develop on it, and they lamented the loss of the great estates and so on. But
that you're talking about his distributist concerns.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, well, they manifest.
You could say this is sorry.
They manifest especially in distributism, but there's a sort of parallel thing that I don't want to get too deep.
Yeah, we're off the track on historical fiction. There's some things we need to drag that back into.
Yes, there's a parallel thing of industrialization that again, because the changing technology also changed the nature of employment somewhat and so on. So, but his concerns, a lot of his concerns were very motivated by those particular things. Was the middle stage industrialization with its giant factories everywhere and so on, and also the tail end of the landed aristocracy that motivated him to make a lot of observations on human nature, which the specifics of what motivated him don't apply here in America, where we're in very late stage industrialism, where things are moving more in the direction of smaller factories and so on, and lots of smaller businesses in varieties, and also where we have tremendous amounts of land, and so far more people here in America own their own homes than you see in something like England in the 1900s and so on. And yet his concerns motivated him to make observations on human nature, and human nature is constant, and we find those so very interesting. And so Chesterton is still very widely appreciated for the things that he did, even though the things that motivated him have largely fallen out of modern American sight.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so go back to, so I went off on that long tangent on the apocalypse. What you were saying before was medieval people had this sense of stability that we don't.
I'm sorry, can I qualify that? Because
yeah,
the way you rephrased it is obviously not true.
Okay.
What I meant by a stable sense of the social order was that they weren't debating communism versus capitalism versus republicanism versus
no, they weren't debating those big
things,
modern systems, but they were I mean, that's one of the, okay, so
that's what I meant there. A much more limited point than the words I used.
Right, but okay, fair enough. But the long version of why we're debating those political things now is because the Middle Ages was a period of curiously rapid social change. We just can't see it because it's so long ago. But for example, one of the major things that happened, you mentioned the 1066. That was a pretty big upheaval. Most of the aristocracy, most of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was killed. Right. So within a generation, their entire social structure was totally upended. The Normans come in, establish themselves as lords over a subject population. There's good evidence from Doomsday Book that the people that had held the land in 1066 were dead by 1086. William had them killed. And that sort of complete social replacement also took place at the level of, for example, towns. I've done a course on towns that your listeners might be curious about doing some of that reading. That the Anglo-Saxons had a fairly well-developed urban population, that particularly in Wessex, there are boroughs that Alfred the Great had established as defensive structures for Wessex. And the Normans come in, and not only do they kill all the nobility, they resettle the towns with new inhabitants and decenter them. So there's the old This is part of what's happening in Shrewsbury in the period, and what some of what Peters actually does play off of, that tension between the Anglo-Saxon population and the Norman overlords. That the Normans founded new centers of towns. They put their castles in the middle there. They create new streets where the market. They refocus the urban environment so that the old part of town is no longer the center of commerce and government and so forth. They build their new cathedrals and such. The 12th century, I mean, the reason Nellis Peters is able to put her stories in the moment that she did is it's a period of terrible, it's called the anarchy, right? It's terrible disruption. And they are, in fact, debating throughout the Middle Ages, what's the role of the king? What's the role of the lordships? What's the role of the towns? What's the role of the universities? What are the role of the monasteries? Magna Carta is a revolt against John as king. All of these things, we look back on them and think, and this to a certain extent is one of the mistakes conservatives constantly make, is they have this idea that there's this sort of stable tradition that we want to get back to. No. what we want is a sense of that consultative building of community that developed particularly in England throughout the Middle Ages, of constant conflict and conversation. So if you want to write good historical fiction, you need to read a lot of history to recognize every single political development that we now take for granted. Monarchy, right? They were making it up as they went along. I did a course on medieval England where our entire story was, well, does the king know what he's doing yet? Not really.
But I thank you for that corrective, because what I was trying to get at was much more theoretical, in the sense of like, in the modern age we've got the idea of the individual as primary and the family as a complete accident, whereas the idea of the family as a primary unit of social organization was a much more settled idea in the Middle Ages. Really, you have a widespread radical individualism in the Middle Ages?
Well, what you don't have is a sense of what the family is yet. Again, 12th century. A lot happens in the 12th century, and that's just the period that I can narrate clearest. But some of these conversations go on throughout the period. There's a massive debate about what marriage is in the 12th century, and particularly this has got me. Some of your viewers may know me from other contexts. Has got me into a lot of trouble for my cheering for the white tradition, meaning European and Christian, not racial. That one of the things that happens in the 12th century is the canon lawyers have a big debate about what constitutes marriage, and they're trying to figure out whether it's the moment of sex, right, consummation, or whether it's the consent of the individuals, right, the man and the woman, the bride and the bridegroom, and it's a concerted effort to wrest control over what makes a marriage from the families, right? So when you say, oh, they knew what the family was, no, they're figuring it out at the time, including to what degree of relation you can actually intermarry. And one of the so there are two significant things that come out of this period. One, that marriage is constituted by the consent of both man and woman, and that the woman as an individual soul has just as much say in this as the man, so that she is in fact pitted against her own family. There's a story by a woman named Christina. It's her own autobiography, or the telling of her story as her own experience. Christina Marquiate, whose family wants to force her to get married, and she gets married, but then she hides behind the drapes from her husband on their wedding night and runs away. And she's supported by her priest to be a virgin, right? But it's in fact it's a contest against the family as this kinship network, which the church is in fact supporting the women against, right? So that's one. The church is also in long conversation about degrees of consanguinity, which may sound arcane and useless until you recognize that in, for example, Islamic culture now, first cousins typically marry. In medieval Christian culture, that's forbidden. It's considered incest, and then marriages will be annulled if people are held in too close relationship to each other. Many of the great political negotiations that, for example, Innocent III was involved in at Fourth Lateran were over whether the kings could be marrying within degrees of consanguinity, women of too close relationship to them. Since the nobility is all related, that's always a problem. So no, even the definition of the family is undergoing massive changes throughout the Middle Ages.
That's actually it's delightful. The thing that you just described. It's a really good picture, because what I had in mind was the modern post-Enlightenment idea of the state as the primary form of human social organization. That is, the what you get, like, say, with Hobbes, where there's the state and the individual, and that's it.
Yes.
And the family is a complete accident, versus the idea that the family was, that your primary loyalty would be to the family, not to the state. However the family was defined, the idea that every person should be loyal first to the state. I mean, they didn't have a state; they had a king, or in some cases an emperor, depending on where exactly you want to talk about. But they didn't have a state in the modern concept anyway, so they couldn't really have a primary loyalty to the state as such.
No, that is more a very 19th, 20th century invention. I made the United States may be. I haven't thought about it in those terms exactly. I mean, being loyal to the United States, the Federation, we may have invented it. That may be our fault.
Well, I mean, I think you see that in Hobbes first, don't you, with the Leviathan?
So I'd need to read Hobbes more carefully. It's been a long time. But okay, so one of this is it's a terrible meditation, and it's actually quite frightening. That I think what we have in modernity is corrupt Christianity. And the reason I say that, it's like the individual relationship. Sorry,
that's pretty non-controversial.
Yeah. Well, I think most of the modern political ideologies that are at war with each other are basically Christian heresies. I've made the long argument about why it's a blog post length. I made the argument about why communism is basically a Christian heresy. It is. It's that's why it's so at odds with the church. It's the direct enemy of the church. But the problem is that Christianity pits the individual against the family.
Well,
think what Jesus said, right? Whoever does not
who loves father mother more than me isn't worthy of me.
Exactly. And the problem, and that's why one of the reasons that in the Middle Ages the church can stand so strongly for women against their own families, right? To say, no, you cannot force your daughter to marry this guy who you think will make a good alliance. She gets to say, right? She gets to consent to whether. Now, you could say, in social terms, how real was their consent, right? How, people put pressure on each other in all sorts of ways. And certainly your dad telling you have to marry this guy. There's a famous play about that, I think. The kids kill each other, right? Or kill themselves over it, because Juliet's father wants her to marry this other guy. And she says, no, I'm in love. And the church marries them, right? The church will marry Romeo and Juliet. And their parents don't want them to. And then the moral of the story is maybe we families shouldn't have forced our kids into doing what they didn't want to. That's the Christian paradigm, right? The individuals get to say. But what does that do in the long run when you lose the church? If you take the church out of the equation, the state fills that role. And that, I think, is what our real danger is in. We've lost the transcendent and we've put the state in its place.
Yeah, it's the closest substitute we have for transcendent, because it transcends at least the individual, but
right.
Not the world. But everything you're describing actually fits in very well as a beautiful example of, as a modern, the thing that I'm very concerned with is the concerns of the locals. And when you look back, that's not the concerns of the people in the Middle Ages. They were concerned with things like what you just described. And so it's a very good example of how in historical fiction, it would be easy to put in concerns of the individual versus the state into somebody in the medieval period, but they didn't even have a concept of the state. That didn't come about for several hundred years. I mean, they didn't have our modern concept of the state. What they had was overlapping
lordships, right? Yes. That would be the way they would think of it. Whether your primary, so you're Christian, so you belong to a universal church, and those have, from the parish to the diocese to the papacy to the monasteries. The monasteries are in constant conflict with their bishops and so forth. And then there's the overlapping secular lordships between your town, maybe the lord of your town, who might be an abbot, or it could be a secular lord, it could be the king. The kings have various alliances, blah, blah. In the Middle Ages, what the problem is the lines of loyalty are so complicated.
Yeah. And do you support your lord over his overlord,
right?
When they're in conflict? Yeah. And so that's it's a wonderful it's a wonderful, I think, example of where a medieval person has concerns. He's got plenty of concerns. They're just different concerns than we have. And
Yes,
so,
and they're
what,
equally as they're equally as dynamic as ours, right? They don't know the answers. They are, as we are, making it up as they go along.
right. That's a very, very important point. And also they have no idea how these things are going to turn out as well, which also introduces a lot of uncertainty. Not only are you making up as you go along, you have no idea who's going to win in terms of who's making it up as they go along.
Right.
But there is,
What they have that we don't tend to carry culturally right now is the expectation that their souls are at stake too, right? So, if you make poor decisions, it's not just going to have an effect in this life; it will affect your eternity.
I do you also think they would have the sense that their decisions, in a practical sense, also would affect their family and their friends? Because one thing that characterizes the very, very contemporary period right now is that radical atomization has gotten to the point, I think, where a great many people don't even conceive of the concept of a personal loyalty. The idea the idea that the things that I do have an effect on my friend, and that actually matters, that I have a duty to consider how these things affect my friend, except in a basically contractual sort of sense. People do it like with regard to like invitations to parties and things like that, but like in a broader sense, the idea that if I'm an honest man, that produces a different household for my children, and that I owe it to them to be that better person, that they might live in the house of an honest man, that that sort of dimension of loyalty,
Okay, so
it's not only your own soul, but that sort of communal aspect in which virtue isn't a purely private matter.
That's beautifully put, and you're right. I don't think we think properly about that anymore. What we do is it's what we're left with is all the toxic effects of all of these beliefs, that your virtue affects the people around you. That's what they're enemies because they definitely want to hurt me. What my enemies say about me, how can you be associated, for example, with my friend Milo? How can you, be tainted with, and then they'll label you with all of these vices, and that taint is expected to spread. And so people virtue signal to show that they're not associated with the taint. The positive version that you're describing, no, I don't think people do have that. The point of living virtuously is that virtue actually has a positive effect on your entire world, right? And that the individual living and that's the medieval understanding would be very strong there. Although, you're saying, are the Middle Ages more concerned with the individual? In certain ways, the Middle Ages are radically concerned with the individual because they're always concerned with the soul. They're always concerned with what affects your own behavior and intentions, and your ethical dilemmas have on you yourself. It's in fact only somewhat in the later Middle Ages that they start characterizing virtue as having that social effect quite so strongly. But what you're describing as, your honesty will in fact create, it will enable your neighbors to behave more honestly as well. That is definitely something that we don't have at the moment. Virtue doesn't seem to be something you have positively. It just seems to be something you signal is you don't have these sins.
Yeah, it's really people have not the concept of virtue, but of ritual purity. Or purity a little bit more generally, because virtue signaling is slightly misnamed. It's really closer to purity signaling.
It's purity signaling, yeah.
I'm not impure.
Yes,
as opposed to the leper who would. There's something fascinating in that the leper, who would, at least sometimes in some places, according to, actually, I think I'm getting this from Ellis Peters, but I
probably
saw it someplace else too. But the leper who would actually call out to people that he was impure, that he needed to warn people not to approach too closely.
That's because they don't actually understand how the disease spreads. So they're
and there's something. Well, they grouped a bunch of things as leprosy, and I think a few of those diseases they weren't actually that far off on. There's one thing we now call leprosy, but at the time there was a collection of skin infections, all of which would get called, if not precisely leprosy, some general name for skin disease. And some skin diseases you actually do want to stay away with.
Right.
But this is, to be fair to them,
they're also concerned with heresy for, I think, similar. It's the reason, so the purity signaling is also orthodoxy signaling as well, right? You're saying I am orthodox in the current terms, and we do carry with us this idea that heretics must be, banished and killed if they are not if they're obdurate, right? And it's so interesting to me that, I mean, I've been declared by my academic colleagues basically a heretic, right? And they say 29 of them in my own divinity school at the University of Chicago signed a statement saying I do not represent the diversity that they want to model in their teaching in history of Christianity and the divinity school more broadly. And I'm like, what? You just said I'm too diverse for your diversity? But what they're actually saying is you're a heretic, right? And they're doing it in exactly the terms that people in the Middle Ages would with heresy, saying your ideas are so dangerous we can't let you live. Think about that.
Yeah. And to be fair to them, ideas cause massive social upheaval. Ideas.
Oh yes, and I think their ideas are the heretical ones. But
there's that's the I mean that's the whenever there's a declaration of heresy, there are two heretics according to two different universal churches.
Well, as Chesterton said, everyone's orthodox to himself.
Yes, there's that wonderful line to said about George Bernard Shaw that that Shaw meant everything he said, and that he was, however, a very unique person. He wasn't trying to be unique. He was just the only member of that, or something other. His primary loyalty was to that vast and universal church of which he was the only member.
Right.
Which does always apply. So it's.
Mind you, the reason that my colleagues called me a heretic, one, because I wrote positively about Milo, but two, because I was arguing that within the universities we need to be practicing having exactly these conversations, because the gut reactions are so powerful. If you don't practice putting people in this uncomfortable situation of recognizing that they're heretics to each other and talk it through, it's going to spill out into the streets, right? And we see it happen over and over and over again in history when communities get to the point where they just can't talk to each other anymore. You should be practicing it in the universities, because if you can't practice it there, exactly, I mean, maybe it's going to happen on YouTube. That would be great, but it's nowhere else are we institutionally set up to have this kind of debate.
Yeah, it's there's an interesting, I mean, a long and interesting subject down that road. Though, if you don't mind me bring it back to historical fiction, because a number of times, whenever I've mentioned something historical, you've gone to supply a bunch of very interesting details and perspective.
I told you I'd get you to study history.
Yeah, no, it's just what I've hoped for, frankly. But in every one of them serves very, very well to indicate, to illustrate, I think, the distinction between, as a modern person looking back, it's very easy to project your own concerns, which were not open questions to the people at the time. They had very different open questions that were, or even sometimes somewhat different open questions that were very, very lively to them, just as live as our modern questions are now, but very different. And this seems to me one thing that historical fiction is I think most difficult for the historical author, or the author who tries to write into history, is to take up the concerns of the time, to put down your own concerns and take up the concerns of the time. And one of the things actually that ties into what we were just talking about is this may very well mean that you have to take very seriously and treat very kindly people you regard as heretics. For example, and to do justice to people who are in say the 1700s who owned slaves. If you're writing some of these people as,
yes, and this is so
figures, they're heretics to us now,
right?
To get inside of their concerns, you have to take as open questions things, and make closed things that were open questions to us now, and take as open questions things that are
well, and even recognizing that, so I brought Robinson Crusoe. He has a slave at one point. He helps a slave escape when he's first in. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That there are debates at the time, right? That nothing is, that we look back on these things. Oh, they owned slaves, and so everybody was happy with it. And like, no, many people weren't, right? That many of the debates that we're in now are the continuations of long-term debates, right? That we have the debate in our modern contemporary society now about slavery because it came up in the past. It's not that we invented it and suddenly discovered that it was evil to hold slaves. It's like the only reason we think it's evil to hold slaves is because we were in a tradition that considered it evil to hold slaves and had a big debate about it.
Yeah, it took the very specifically Christians who thought it evil to own slaves many hundreds of years to convince everyone else.
Right. It takes time to convince them, interestingly, to change their practice. And, I think what's interesting about some of the things, so for example, arguments about how to treat either the mentally ill or disabled or different in terms of their gender expression or something like that. It truly goes back to at least the 15th century. I found it in one of these texts that we were reading from my Virtues and Vices course, that Dionysius the Carthusian is saying specifically that it is a worse sin to act viciously against someone who is mentally ill or disabled. And like, wow, okay, it's there in the 15th century. That our culture cares about these things often has very, very deep roots. And it's curious how, you're talking about writing historical fiction. Some of the things that we care about now were concerns in the past. And being able to tell the difference between our inheritance of those debates and our projecting them back onto the past is very challenging.
No, that is itself also a very interesting point. It's curious. Pride and Prejudice, which let me see, I had that upside down. Right? Well, that's going to come out wrong either way. A book I like so much that I actually have been varnishing the things so that it lasts longer. But it's fascinating to look at that, because this is the other sort of historical fiction. I alluded this to my video. It's not normally called historical fiction. I should mention the question, but fiction that was written a long time ago, in a time period where people now will write historical fiction about that time period. Pride and Prejudice happens to be a great example because so many people write historical fiction and set it either literally at Pemberley or very, very close there too. And so there's something very interesting in reading. This now, I guess what's the proper term, that it's a primary source for the time period. Would fiction of a time period count as a primary source historically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's another thought that I had when we were talking just now. So there's one, the debates of the past may in fact be still our debates. And so that's important. The other is this problem of method, right? And I'd say sometimes you were saying you have to imagine yourself into the understanding of someone whose ideas you would dislike. That is my entire method as a teacher, in the sense that you're saying primary sources, right? The first thing that I do with my beginning students, for example, in History of European Civilization, is get them to be aware of the fact that the texts are literally primary to them. You need to figure out what the author tells you about why he or she was writing, what the text itself can tell you about the concerns of the day in which the author was writing, and then and only then can you start using it as a historical source. You need to read through it, see the world through the lens of the concerns that the author had at his own time, in order to be able to figure out what you can learn from it about history, right? And so anything that's written in the past is potentially a primary source, because you are reading it for, you're reading against it in certain ways, because you may not be reading it for the purposes for which it was written, but you need to understand why it was written in order to be able to read it at all. And that's particularly challenging for mindsets that modern readers don't share. And for me, that's always been faith, right? That I'm trying to show you what it was like for medieval Christians to read the scriptures, to practice the liturgy, to pray from their own perspective. And rhetorically, as an academic writer, that's very, very challenging, because you set your reader up to imagine themselves into these settings. Academic writers don't like that. Academic readers don't like that. They want to be told what it's true. And I'm like, I can't show you what was true unless I can show you for this, particularly for things like faith, devotion, prayer. I can't explain it to you in terms that give it life unless I can show it to you from within. And so some of my academic work, some of my academic colleagues think of as too fictional. And I'm like, it's all footnoted. I'm showing you where I'm getting all of these examples, and like you with your proverb, your phrases, and what kinds of meditations people might be having. But I put it in the second person. So I say, imagine yourself, and people freak out on me. It's like, I don't want to do that. I'm an atheist. And I'm like, but you're a historian. You should want to figure out why the people who wrote the text that you're reading as a historian wrote them in the first place. And then you have a better idea, I hope, of understanding what it means to you now. And these are layered processes. They're very, very challenging.
Well, especially for an atheist. There's actually, well, worse actually is not the atheist, but the atheistic children of atheists. I actually have a number of things I've written about how, because at one point I was toying with the idea of saying that atheists can't write good stories. And that's not it. It's that the atheistic children of atheists can't write good stories because they don't have any stories to tell. Because the problem that they come up with, this is my contention, is the problem that they come against is that they have grown up in a fundamentally meaningless world, and therefore nothing can actually happen.
Right.
Within a fundamentally meaningless world, there can be nothing of any significance that happens, and you can't tell a story about nothing.
Right.
Pache waiting for Godot.
I think Waiting for Godot is your best example.
Well, but it was explicitly written to be that, and it's also a comedy. It's the whole reason it's funny.
It's a very dark comedy, yeah.
It is, but it's also funny because you can't. It's doing what you can't do, and there's sort of only one way that you can do what you can't do, and that's the way they did it, which is to say in that sort of farcical manner. But that one exception aside, because sort of taking the one self-referential way it's possible to do the impossible, that is to say, you can only do the impossible if you're pretending to do the impossible, not really doing it. So it pretends to do it rather than really does it. But that's the problem that the atheist has, is that in a meaningless world, you can't have any real stories. And so an atheist, someone who becomes an atheist, will have the memories of there being meaningful things, and he can suspend his disbelief because he has the idea of meaning, at least as a concept.
Right.
But the thing I've encountered is the atheistic children of, and someone who converts will encounter meaning, can then, who starts off an atheist and converts can encounter meaning and then go with it. But the problem is that the child of an atheist will not be raised with meaning, because whatever a person has, children there's a curious sort of terror that accompanies children that makes people honest with their own children, mostly. And people know that their children will believe them, so it makes them very hesitant to tell their children fundamental lies. They'll lie up and down about whether or not there's actually cookies in the house, but they're
my television broke when my son was 2.
Yeah, but fundamental lies, people are very unwilling to tell children. I mean, people are very unwilling to tell fundamental lies to other people's children too, because they know that they'll be believed. Whatever you tell an adult, it's on them if they believe you. I mean, if they're dumb enough to believe the stupid things you said, that's their fault. But a child will believe you, and so there's a sort of terror of lying to a child. Not well expressed, and again, only on deep matters, not on superficial ones.
Well, I think, okay, so the higher version of that is in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, when he's talking about when children, thinking about fairy stories as being particularly childish. It's like, no, children are actually pretty good at telling the difference between, what they want to know is the difference between make-believe and real, not because they are more likely to believe fantasy, but because they're actually more grounded in the real.
That's an idea Chesterton has too.
He probably got it from Chesterton. He liked Chesterton.
They may have worked it out together. They did know each
I don't
other,
think they did. I'm not. Well, they never. Tolkien doesn't really talk about Chesterton much, but yes, they're obviously of the same conversation.
I could be making that up, but I thought that they would have met, because
they may have met, but Tolkien didn't write about him very much. He met Sayers and didn't like her.
Huh.
Or at least he says that he didn't like Lord Peter. He thought he didn't like the character.
I've never gotten. I couldn't get past Tom Bombadil. It's a shameful admission.
Okay, we'll do another one, and I'll indoctrinate you into Tolkien.
Well, it's a special weakness I have. I can't read songs without knowing what the music is. It's just a very personal weakness. And every time I get to Tom Bombadil, I'd see this song and I couldn't figure out what the music was, and I couldn't get past it. It's a weird weakness.
There's music. The Swan, Michael Swan did music for some of them.
Huh. I'll have to look that up. Maybe that'll finally enable me to get through it. It's a very weird weakness. But anyway, not of any moment. But the thing about the atheist, and this gets to the problem that you were discussing, is that they don't grow up with the concept of meaning, and if they remain atheists, they don't encounter the concept of meaning other than as a very foreign thing, and a false foreign thing, so they don't anyone who comes from a religious background can, with some effort, I think, tend to imagine some other religious background because they have at least some concepts of meaning. They might be overly tempted to map things too much. There are
Hmm.
different concepts in different religions, but at the very least, you have a concept there are things that truly matter, and so you can understand somebody even when he has a concept of different things that matter. At least that he has that relationship of thinking that they matter, which is the thing the atheist never really encounters. As they grow up in this atheistic setting, they don't encounter the idea that anything.
I love, this is perfect, that stories carry meaning. Absolutely. That's why we tell stories, because we are giving ourselves patterned understandings. And
Yeah, and
what you're also doing is, in fact, justifying my life project, which is showing, I write for academics because I think intellectually they should be curious. I'm disappointed when they're not. But for Christians as well, to say these are our stories, and losing the deep embeddedness in this, and you can call it mythology, but it's history, right? The Christian figural thinking is critical to your ability to, in fact, see God, right? That's the great meditation that I have in my second book, the one that came out this past year, is showing you the way in which praying to Mary enabled medieval Christians to contemplate God, right? It's a revelation through understanding her role in the incarnation. And with that vision, life is magnificent and joyous, and you know praise be to God, joy to the world. Without it, it's just gray and drab, and as you're saying, meaningless.
Yeah, well, look at what, whenever you see an atheistic writer like in Hollywood trying to write a heroic story, look at what you actually get. You get the story of a person who has a special ability to help, basically deciding whether he's going to be completely worthless or only mostly worthless for no reason. And it pretty much, and what comes to turn, because there's always that part where the temptation is basically his inclination to be completely worthless, and then at some point somebody awakens in him some sort of impulse for no reason that he can explain, that he'll only be mostly worthless, and so he'll actually do something for somebody, um not for any reason,
It's all
because he can't give a
it's a
reason.
Christ story. They're all Christ stories. And Jim Papandrea did a great book on the way superheroes carry. They're usually heresies, right? But they're all it's the deeply embedded savior narrative in our culture, right?
But it's falling away. I mean, if you look at stories in the last 20 years, they're trying
Mm,
for it. They so fundamentally don't understand it that the person isn't a savior. The person, this is actually something that came up. Because you don't have the idea of self-sacrifice. And that's sort of the sine qua non, I think, of the hero, is that the hero is a person who is willing to sacrifice themselves for something else. Could be something higher, could be something lower. Either one works, actually, especially the latter within a Christian context. That the higher sacrifice itself for the lower is a very
mm.
Christian idea. Um, but in any case, who is the classic hero, like in the way that George Lucas would, like to think of it. There's the person who is living the ordinary life, and then they're called on to go, and they don't know whether or not they're going to succeed. That's not the relevant part. The part is not whether or not, it's not, you have the power to stop this. You're the only one who has the power to stop this. If you just decide to go and play gin rummy instead, we're all going to die. I hope you like us more than gin rummy is the modern version of this.
Hmm.
The more ancient version is you have an opportunity to try to stop this. And then the person will then risk his life because there's the opportunity simply to possibly help. He goes off on this quest to help, uncertain of his success or failure, as opposed to the modern version of this, where he's quite more or less certain of his success. He just has to decide whether or not he's actually going to lift his finger to do something. And so in the more classical story, and by classical I mean written by people 50 years ago. I
Yeah,
don't mean
I'd say
classical in any sort
you
of.
can't go that far back, because Beowulf is a good example of the sort of tension between the heroic and the Christian, in the degree to which Beowulf fights the monsters for his own fame and glory, but also to protect his people. That's why he goes after the dragon that kills him.
Yeah, when I said classical, I'm sorry, I meant within our own very limited context. Because by the time you get to the pre-Christian ancient world, things change radically again. Um, but within our society that was a much less decayed Christian society, um, when people would write that heroic story, it was of somebody who would be willing to undertake a sacrifice without certainty of its success, but simply because there was the opportunity that perhaps he could help, he will then make the sacrifice of sacrificing his ordinary life in order to go do it. I mean, even
well, The
correct me if I'm wrong,
Hobbits.
but
You
isn't the
really do
Hobbit?
need to read The Lord of the Rings.
Well, I've read the Hobbit, but isn't
No,
that
The Lord of the Rings.
right?
The
Right? Isn't that uh, Bilbo's nephew? Isn't that what Frodo does? That
Bless
there's
your
this
heart.
quest.
You don't know.
Well, I've seen the movies, but that doesn't.
Oh my
I'm not
God.
sure that counts.
No,
I'm
it doesn't
assuming the
count.
movies don't count. That's my general
They
assumption.
don't,
Of the
because they
movies.
miss the theology, of course.
Yeah. So, but isn't that? I mean, there's the band of heroes who sets out, or again, towards the end, Aragorn, who I think you had mentioned is a Christ figure. He goes and leads a charge against. Again, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong. He goes and leads a charge against Saruman simply to buy time for somebody he doesn't even know is presently alive.
Sauron, yes. So when you're talking about the degree of which a Catholic story has fellowship of saints, that is the Fellowship of the Ring works that way. That there's a really great study of the way the hero play, Verlin Flieger's study of the different hero characters in the Lord of the Rings, that they play on different registers. So Aragorn is sort of the romantic king. He comes from, now I'm blanking on the word. You don't know where he grows up as Strider, right? And what is the word that you say? The king that comes out of the ordinary circumstances and then is revealed, right? And then there's Frodo, who is the nephew of the previous adventurer, who in fact doesn't survive the quest, right? He loses a finger and loses his joy in life. He needs to leave, right? Because he can't stop suffering the effects of having been bearing the ring. There's Sam, however, who in fact is the great savior character is Sam, because he goes back to the Shire and replants it, right? He has a gift of soil from Galadriel that he uses to bring back all the trees that have been cut down. And he is the one that ends up with a family and therefore lineage and therefore the stories to carry on. So, which of the great, and Gandalf is another kind of character. He dies and is resurrected, but he doesn't really die because he can't, because he's kind of an angel. He's reformed and given incarnate form again to be sent back in. What Tolkien does that's so magnificent is he plays lots of different layers of hero type off of each other. Merry and Pippin are another, that they are the friends who serve and they offer themselves as servants either to Theoden or to Denethor. And their service is very interestingly valent, so that Merry is serving Theoden as he loves the old man. He loves him as a son, whereas Pippin's pride is stung, and so he's going to serve Denethor sort of as nobly as he can, right? And Eowyn is obviously yet another character. Every single one of the characters matters to Tolkien, and the mistake that readers often make in worrying about Tolkien's perspective on his races or his women or things like that is they need to see the whole set, the system that Tolkien is trying to show you. It's not one character. And when you're talking about the Protestant tendency to look for the character, that I think is also one of the misreadings of Tolkien, is also trying to look for that single hero.
Yeah, the heroes exist in community. Yeah, it's that's very interesting. And just to finish up the point, because I think it ties in with what you're saying, is that the problem that the atheist has is that, because in theory he should be able to just put himself in somebody else's perspective, and even if he doesn't believe it, suspend his disbelief and write a story within something else. But the problem is he's got the same problem as a blind man painting, that he's never experienced the thing. So that I could, with a great deal of effort, probably I could write with effort I could write a Muslim story. With a great deal of effort I could probably write a Hindu story. If I really spent a few years actually immersing myself in learning and so on, I could eventually imaginatively put myself in a different place, because I at least have an experience of it. And if my experience is different, my beliefs are different, I have an experience along those lines, so I can imagine different shapes to the same sort of substance. Whereas the problem the atheist has is he's never encountered meaning in any context, in any form. He's never encountered it, so he can't imagine a different meaning than the one that he holds to, because he simply has never encountered the meaning. He's heard about what meaning is like. He's seen descriptions of meaning. And so there's this wonderful thing I have on my shelf. I found this in a Walmart. This thing is supposed to be a brown bear. And if you look at it, like I hopefully can see this, it was made in India. Very interestingly, you can see it's got the body of an elephant, and it's got the head of a cow, but with teeth. And so you've got this thing that was supposed to be a brown bear, and each one looked a bit different too. They're handmade. And I saw this thing, and I had no use for it whatsoever, but it was one of the best examples I'd ever seen in my life of human beings working from a description of a thing they've never seen. And this is, to some degree, what you get when the atheist is trying to deal with meaning. He's heard descriptions of it. So here we have that that pleasure is nice, and here we have that suffering is bad. So okay, and that's as far as they go, because they've never seen it. They've never seen meaning. They don't, to ask somebody who has no concept of meaning to understand that there is meaning in suffering, that suffering can have a purpose,
Mm-hmm.
that suffering can itself be transformed into something even positive, that something redemptive, is a lot to ask of a person who's never heard of any kind of meaning whatsoever. I got in this hilarious Twitter exchange where I was mentioning this problem, and someone was saying, I was an atheist raised by atheists, and I think I write good stories, and it's pointing out that the problem, like an atheist can't understand redemption, for example. The closest they can come is a change. And so, but the problem is that applies to, like, say, a guard at a Nazi concentration camp who takes pity on somebody, but then decides afterwards, no, that was a bad idea, and goes and is then very cruel to the person,
Mm-hmm.
and sees that really he's supposed to be very cruel to the inmates. So he has a change of heart and goes and does his job. That's not a redemption story, but within the bear description, that would be a redemption story. And his response is, "Oh, that's really interesting. I should write something about that."
Well, so I did another podcast where we were talking about this problem of can you reason your way into faith? And I kept saying no, because all you get with reason is human sacrifice. And Bartolome de las Casas made that argument in the 16th century, in trying to argue against the Spanish killing the Aztecs and the Incas, whom they were trying to conquer and convert, saying, well, in fact, you have to understand they're totally civilized, and the most civilized response to worship is human sacrifice. I've been trying to figure out the way to explain that sense of revelation, what it is that seen through the gospel actually shows you about human existence and reality and meaning. And I mean, telling a story so that you try to get inside of it is, that's the way Augustine said you should catechize to pagans back in the 5th century, that you're trying to show them the way in which they belong in the story of salvation. But how do you do it if they have no sense of story? I'd never considered that as like, wow, that you're right. That's the barrier we're dealing with. When you keep saying that the atheist raised by atheists, there's my teacher, Caroline Walker Bynum, did a book on the resurrection of the body. And one of the problems of the resurrection as a doctrine is saying, well, the body dies and it decays. And so how is the flesh brought back as the matter that it actually is? 12th and 13th century scholastics, being what they were, they tested this out in different ways. And the best, the sort of most telling example is, well, what if you had, someone who was raised eating, like you're raised with the flesh of what you were when you died. And it's like, well, but what about all the animals you ate, right? So they're the Far Side, jokes, right? You end up covered in cows or something. But what if you are a human being who's raised eating only human embryos? What would be your matter, right? Because you would have only ate, babies, or, you'd only eaten other people's flesh. How would you ever be resurrected? Your problem is, I think, similar. It's like if an atheist is raised by atheist and has no concept of story and meaning, how can you even reach them? That's the most terrifying thing I've heard, I think, in ever.
That's the great problem we face at the present time. C.S. Lewis described it in a somewhat different way when he said that when Christians were preaching to pagans, it was like people who were preaching to virgins. But the problem in the modern era
It's
is that
worse. I think it's worse. People preaching to people who have no concept of story, and you recognize that's we started off with historical fiction, and I think we've come to a place where this is actually why historical fiction is so important. It's like it gets people interested in history. And one of the great tragedies of history as a discipline right now is that we basically, I mean, we've been struggling with narrative, whether we do narrative history, but we barely teach history anymore. We barely teach event and choice and motivation and virtue and morality. All we do is as a discipline, unfortunately, is plaster onto all of these previous dilemmas our own solutions, right? So racism is bad. Gender equality is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the previous, moment is condemned. If you don't share all of our contemporary, obsessions with diversity and inclusion, you're out. It's caricatured the entire human past in a horrible way. It's driven people from the discipline. It means people know nothing. I mean, when I've been trying to make this argument on Twitter to no effect that, if you care about consent, it's because you're within a long tradition of Christians caring about consent. I'm arguing this with a woman who insists that Jesus was a rape baby. And I say, well, that goes against absolutely all of Christian theology and interpretation of this story, which was it mattered that Mary consented. There's no salvation unless it was Mary's free will in the moment that the angel came to her. And without the background in the even the kinds of things I'm telling you about, overlapping lordships and decisions that people made about kingship, where are we going to go politically? Never mind, spiritually. We have no ground left because people don't have any of these stories anymore. And what they have are these horrible caricatures of, oh, it was simpler in the past, or oh, it was, it's one way or the other, right? It was simpler in the past and we are all like more meaningful and complex now, which we're not. Or we're actually quite denuded of meaning. It's disturbing thinking about how vacant most modern culture is. Or we have this, caricature of the past is all, basically evil, and we're the only virtuous moment, which is again ridiculous. We're corrupt beyond sinning in ways that in the past people barely considered.
At least until you get to Rome. Yeah.
Well, yes. Paganism ends in human sacrifice. That's the point.
Well, I mean, and moreover, I mean, it's I don't know how historically accurate. There's this movie called Caligula, which is a very strange movie and not one I can generally recommend. I had an odd history of if there's one director who wanted to make a historical film and one producer wanted to make a historical film and one producer wanted to make a pornographic film.
Oh, so they succeeded.
Okay, the version I saw must have been highly edited, and I wasn't in the room the whole time either.
The one that I saw when I was a teenager and we snuck in because we were underage was
okay, because I saw this, I want to say I saw this on like Netflix or something, and I wasn't the primary one watching it, so I was in and out of the room.
Did it have the machine that went across the
cutting heads off?
Cutting heads off. Yes, that was it.
Yeah. But one of there's
I mean, the Romans were pretty bad.
Well, I have no idea whether or not anyone ever made such a machine. It's at least within the realm of possibility someone could have. They could have engineered.
They did have gladiatorial games. I mean, those were human sacrifice. They were they were literally. I mean, they were fights to the death in honor of triumphs and sacred festivals.
Yeah, until commercial. They became too commercial later on, and there, as I understand, there are actually proclamations by the emperors that like you guys have to actually kill each other some of the time. You can't just keep on not killing each other because it's expensive to kill.
It's expensive, right? Because it took a while to train them to fight properly. But
exactly,
yes.
As I understand, because at first it started in they take their captured foes and then make their enemies fight each other to the death, and then eventually they train them, and 4 centuries later or something like that. It was so expensive to kill off a gladiator.
Well, then they just get a few Christians and kill. No.
but the gladiators.
But they didn't let the Christians fight. That was no fun.
Yeah, well, and they had. There were the people who fought the animals. There were the people who fought. It was so complicated. But anyway, that's something I do think it's worth remembering in modern times. That is, as we see our own culture degenerating.
We've been here before.
Yeah, Rome had Rome still had some things on us. But in Caligula, there's actually this wonderful scene where there are all sorts of things going on in the background, and I'm sure some of the people didn't have clothing, but there were people juggling, there were people doing other things, lots and lots of things going on in the background while who's Caligula's uncle or grandfather?
Tiberius.
Tiberius, thank you. When Tiberius was utterly bored by it all, paying no attention whatsoever to the dozens or of people doing extraordinary things.
Is Peter O'Toole Tiberius?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah.
I believe so. They did a good job with the makeup too, and showing the later degeneration, the skin diseases.
Yes, yes.
But also that wonderful line that's probably not historical, but was still great when he had said to someone, "Look, talking about Romans generally, they're pigs. In my old age, I've become a swineherd." I doubt
we should end on a happier note.
Yes. I think that's a good idea. I mean, of course, properly speaking, the happy note to end on is, I think, one that at least many medievals, as individuals, might have pointed to as well. That that this world will never be fixed till it's over. That the true happiness of the world is in its ending and the place where it's going. It's always, and this sort of fits in with what we were saying about everyone having their concerns, that this world's always going to be swaying one way or another and fixing, almost falling over in one direction by then just lurching over the other side to almost fall off in the other way, occasionally stumbling and having to pick itself up. And through it all, there is Christ, who is the Alpha and the Omega, who is, whichever way it lurches as it goes, it eventually will get to its destination. So at least that's, perhaps you can give a good medieval spin on something like, there have to have been medievals who will have talked about that, because that's just Christian through all the ages.
Yes, because what medieval Christians kept in mind was Revelation, the book, right? And the vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, and the vision of the reality that we are made to participate in, which is singing praises before the throne of God. And to delight in his presence, and to want nothing more than to have his face shine upon us. And that is why when you see pictures of the baby in nativity scenes, he's shining. He's carrying the light of heaven. And when we look on Christ, we look on that light, and that is what our souls yearn for. And that's the reality for which we were made.
There's an interesting sense. If you read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce?
I'm not as much a Lewis fan as I am a Tolkien fan, so
I understand that.
Is The Great Divorce the hell story, when the
purgatory, really?
The busload of people get to be in heaven for a bit and they can't see it?
Yeah. Well, yes. When they get to heaven, when they actually sort of they get on a bus, and there's a sojourn sort of into, it's really more an antechamber for heaven, though it's an open field.
You're not sure where they are, but they're so trapped in their own misery that they can't see the blessedness.
Yes, and well, but there's an interesting transition, because if they get onto the bus, many of them don't. Many of them just sort of stay in hell.
Right.
But when they get onto the bus, they come to a place where everything is bright and shining, and so much more real than they are. You described them, the souls there looked like grease stains on a window compared to it. And the water was so real that when he stepped on it, he couldn't even sink into it at all, and slipped down and fell. And so, sort of borrowing that metaphor, I think an interesting way to wrap this up is that there's a sense in which all history is historical fiction, because this world is not complete in itself. The world itself is a story that has not finished being told, and is coming into its reality, but hasn't reached it yet. And so in that sense, all history is historical fiction, because it's the history of a fiction. It's the history of a thing made. So how about we end on that note?
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. God bless.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you found that conversation as interesting as I did when I was in it. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.